we're off and running.
Woo.
Well, welcome everybody, and I'm glad you could come, and I thought we should just try to get folks up to speed who are interested in what's going on here. And this is very informal, so feel free to just, let's have some conversation and ask me questions or give me opinions or whatever. If you give me opinions, you'll have to give me a minute to get to write down notes. So basically what I wanted to do, since there's so much going on here, is to, okay, now it doesn't want to go down to the next slide. There we go. Is to give you guys an update and see what you're interested in. So I thought that basically what I wanted to do is cover these items. What's led up to the current situation, the governor's task force stand on child protection, related developments, and what our goals are both for the task force and for safe passage. So, so eventually up to today, I think most people know most of this, and I'm just going to turn off my webcam if that's okay. Nobody really cares, right, to see me?
Sure.
Okay.
Okay.
And all right, and then I think you all know that somewhere on Memorial Day of this year, there was the first in a series of investigative reports that were done by this reporter Brandon Stahl from the trip, and he has, I think, done 4 more since then. But when he first decided he wanted to do something on child welfare, he asked around, and one of the things that was really gratifying is that when he talked to people at the legislature, like Tina Liebling and Kathy Sharon, I think, who are heads of the key committees in the House and Senate, respectively, people said talk to safe passage because they've been down here lobbying us effectively for the past several years. So I think all that legwork paid off at that point. And then other people like Citizens Review Panel people, Denise Graves at the Hennepin County Citizens Review Panel, for example, people referred them to us, and I think that's because of all the work we've done the last 4 or 5 years to talk about this subject. So he did this investigative reporting series, and this is not wanting me to go to the next slide. There. In May, there was an introductory article, and then the big one was on Labor Day, and this was the Eric Dean case. And I'll post this PowerPoint on the website, but basically, if you click on these, when I was clicking on it before, it did not want to take me to the story, but it looks like it's going to do that now. Labor Day was the Eric Dean story. That's the one where they had the picture of the little boy who was all beat up and had been reported child protection 15 times. And I think they investigated once and closed the case. They did family assessment a couple times, and the rest of the time they screened it out. And that just put people over the top. I still get emails and calls from people, and including people from other parts of the country that know me and have been tracking this, and they just say they can't get that photo, that picture of that kid out of their mind. It's haunting them. Then he followed up in a story somewhat later on the failures of the family assessment program, and featured several other children, including, of course, Eric Dean was a rural situation, and he was a Caucasian kid. Then he followed up with stories that included African-American kids and others. And that was talking about the failures of the family assessment program, which basically has become the voluntary version of child protection in Minnesota, at least in the big counties. I don't think it's uniformly become voluntary, but in Hennepin and I think Ramsey, people are given the option whether to work for child protection. If you go to Washington County or some of the smaller counties, it's not an option. It's more like family assessment is an alternative to court. The concept being we'll work with you, but if you don't kind of work your case plan and cooperate with us, then we'll take you to court, do a CHIPS case. So there's various ways that it's implemented around the state, but in the big counties, and probably therefore for the majority of cases, it's become pretty voluntary, and that was pretty clear from that particular story. In between that, there were some editorials, and the Star Tribune took it on as a major editorial topic. And all of these stories were Sunday paper, front page, above the fold. So they were like the major story of the week that they've been working on. So they poured a lot of effort into this. And then the most recent one a few weeks ago was the child fatalities. The reporter went back and got information on every one of the 56 child fatalities since 2005. And so he put that on the website with pictures, with a summary of what happened, and with a link to the Fatality Review Committee report. So after the Labor Day one, as you know, the governor appointed a task force on child protection, and that's off and running now. So just to review, in case you haven't read all this stuff or it's been a while, the governors wanted two immediate steps. One was a rapid consultation system where workers could pick up the phone and say, hey, I don't know what to do with this case. Help me out here. And then the other was monthly random screenings. I haven't heard anything about the monthly random screening. I keep forgetting to ask. But the issue there, of course, is that if their consultation is with people who created the policies and practices that got us into this situation, then they're just going to, continue to advise people to do the same things. So we'll see how that works out. But the charge then to the task force was three areas. One is to review the policies, laws, and protocols. Second was enhance accountability. And third was to analyze capacity and resources. And that third one, I think, is important because what the governor was saying is, I want you to tell us if we need more resources and where. So at the first meeting of the task force, the governor came himself. He kicked off the task force, and he stayed for the first hour of discussion. And these are the things that he reinforced. And I think all of you know this, but the governor and I, when we were both young pups, worked together doing street work with runaways and street kids in Boston. And so I've seen him in some very dicey situations. And it was a very kind of dangerous environment because, it was just a place for the street scene to happen indoors. And so he acquitted himself nicely, and I think there's a certain bond that you get when you're in that kind of a setting that you kind of trust each other in a way that doesn't come up in an office setting. So I trust him completely in terms of his motivation and his desire to see something positive. I don't think he's been getting the best advice, and I think, hopefully we can help him to sort through that. So who's on the governor's task force? Well, there's 26 members. And as you can, I'm just going to pull up the list. As you can guess, it's fairly political. You got the state commissioner, Cindy Jessen. Judith Brumfield is a local county human services director. I'm not going to go through all these, but basically when you look at, here's Peggy Flanagan, who's the executive director of Children's Defense Fund. You would think she would have a child welfare background, but she's actually a community organizer because Children's Defense Fund hasn't done child welfare work for over 10 years.
Really?
But, gotten over, yeah. I mean, nationally they do, but not in Minnesota. I mean, that's why one of the main reasons why we set up state tactics, because there was no advocacy in this area. Jim Koppel, who is now actually taking over the lead position in the Department of Human Services, but he was the director of Children's Defense Fund, and I met with him and I said, hey, we're thinking about getting into this. What are you guys doing? And he says, well, we stopped doing it because it was too hard. We kept trying to get bills through and we couldn't get them through, and our funders got impatient with us, so we started doing things like minimum wage and children's health and other issues. So Peggy Flanagan doesn't really know much about child welfare issues, but she is a good advocate. Then you got law enforcement. You got the sheriff from Mower County. You got me. You got an early Head Start manager from a small, area of the state. Chief Blair Anderson is a police chief from St. Cloud, and he is good. He's a piece of work, I'll tell you. He's a no-nonsense type of guy. The big one is Kathleen Blatz, who was the Chief Justice of the Minnesota Supreme Court, and who also was the founder of the Children's Justice Initiative, which was a big initiative that's still going on to try to get juvenile justice and child welfare people to work closer together. And she is really taking a strong lead on this, and I'll fill in more on that later, but we're very lucky to have her. Mai Kao Hang is the president of Wilder Foundation. She's very much a county person. She worked in Ramsey County, and she is on all of the issues so far very strongly supporting the county's point of view. Stacey Hennon is the director of Grant County Social Services, but she's also the chair of the Minnesota Association of Local Social Services Administrators. So she represents the County Social Services Administrators. Molly Kenny is from Greater Minneapolis Crisis Nursery. Lisa Hollensteiner is an emergency room physician that I recruited for the task force, and they accepted her. She wrote an op-ed piece right after the governor's task force got, right after, I think, the Matt Dean case, and the governor quoted her extensively in his, when he announced the task force. Ron Kresh is the representative from the Republican side. Joe Muller is the representative from the Democratic side, PFL. Mark Hudson is the director of the Children's Resource Center at Children's Hospital, and that's a forensic investigation unit that gets the really heavy child sexual abuse and physical abuse cases and does forensic interviewing of children so that they can be, their testimony can be used in court. He's the chair of the work group that I'm on. I'll fill you in on that. So he's a really strong person, a strong advocate. There's another director of County Social Services, Kathy Johnson. Carrie Jones is the chairwoman of the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe, and she has not come very much. Robert O'Connor is an African-American professor, social work professor at Metropolitan State, really solid guy, very knowledgeable, easy to work with. Here's a local county commissioner, Todd Pastor. Senator Kathy Sharon is the chair of the Senate Health and Human Services Committee. Gene Quam is the dean of the College of Education and Human Development at the U. Edward Toussaint is the former chief judge of the Court of Appeals. Maureen Randall is a parent advocate from Prevent Child Abuse, Minnesota, with Nicholas County Attorney and Senator Julie Rosen, who's the Republican there. So that's the group. You can see that there, once you kind of got a representative for every group that absolutely had to be there, there wasn't too much room for, other folks. And I think basically it's a panel that started out being weighted very heavily in support of the status quo, and that was a big concern initially. When you think about, these three people here, the county people and the two co-chairs are very much county people and status quo people. Mai Kao is as well, Stacey Hennon, and some of the people that surprisingly are as the Greater Minneapolis Crisis Nursery and some of the other folks. So it turned out that we were starting out kind of in the hole in terms of pushing any reforms, but it's going better now.
So Rich, Joe,
yep.
How would you say the county's point of view comes across in the task force meetings?
It comes across as, first of all, feeling very much like under the gun and criticized, and here we are working our tails off, and it's a really tough job, and everybody's beating on us. And, I understand that. It's actually that is what's happening. So, it's not
right.
Unrealistic. The other thing is they are doggedly trying to hold on to family assessment as the preferred way to do it.
Why is that, do you think?
I think that's because they've invested many of them invested most of their careers in trying to make it work. So it's kind of hard to give up. And they're just not politically aware of the fact that it's pretty overwhelming in terms of nobody's with them on this one at this point. It's not that people want to start going in with hobnail boots and being disrespectful to parents and treating them badly and removing kids at the drop of a hat. Nobody's in that spot, but that's where the counties think everybody is. And they don't want to go back to where they were. So
is there any mention of the fact that it's, I'll say, a lower cost / lower staffing approach?
No. What they refer to is the research on it that says that it's as safe or safer. And they haven't talked a lot about cost benefit. So one of the key issues that come up on that point is that there are some pretty credible critics of family assessment that have emerged nationally. There's two in particular. One is a guy named Ron Hughes, who's at some institute. I can never remember the name of it. But, it's got all the words like Child Welfare and Institute for this and that. But his institute has done much of the training in Ohio for state workers, and he did a research paper, where he did a survey of all of the assessments or the evaluation of family assessment across some different states, and came to the conclusion that basically they were not real research, that they were what he calls promotional research, meaning that the purpose of them was to demonstrate that family assessment is, or differential response, as it's called, generically, is the way to go. And so he really debunked much of the evaluation that they're saying is positive. And then on the heels of that, there's a law professor at Harvard, Elizabeth Barthollet, who has done a much longer assessment along the same line. Well, it's obviously the people who are in support of family assessment are criticizing those two people very strongly, but we have heard from the guy from Ohio testified in our work group, and so people are hearing the other side of the story is what I'm getting at. So let me get to that, because I need to give you the background of these work groups so you know what I'm talking about. So it's an unwieldy size task force, obviously, 26 people sitting around a table, you're not going to get much done. So wisely, I think the two co-chairs, which are Commissioner Cindy Jessen and Tony Carter, who is the chair of our county. She's a county commission, the chair of Ramsey County Board of Commissioners, but she's also the president of the Association of Minnesota Counties. So that's the hat she's wearing at this task force, representing the counties. So those are the two co-chairs, and they split the task force up in three groups: screening and transparency, which was led by Kathleen Glass; training and supervision by Kathy Johnson, who's the local social service director I mentioned; and then family assessment and resources, which is Dr. Mark Hudson, and that's the one I'm on. So early on, they had a series of panels and experts, and they were all people who were supporting the status quo, and there was a certain amount of mumbling and grumbling behind the scenes. And so the work groups, once we got established, started inviting our own people and bringing in some outside voices. Excuse me. So who's testified? Just an overview. The Office of the Legislative Auditor came in and did the same presentation they did 2 years ago, in which they said, well, things are actually pretty okay. And then they went into the details of their findings, which show that things aren't okay. And then the fact that every county is pretty much making up their own version of child protection, and that the outcomes, as you might get, vary widely across the board. And so the task force, this is, I think, the first meeting, to their credit, immediately picked up on that and said, wait a minute, what you're saying is that the people are doing an adequate job around the state, but none of your findings support that. So that lasted about 10 minutes, I mean, it was a pretty sharp group, and they saw right through that. But it was an example of trying to bring in people who support the status quo. Then Dave Thompson, who retired last year, came in and did a presentation saying family assessment is great, and here's the reasons for it. And recently they brought in David Sanders from Casey Family Programs. Now that's a really interesting one. He used to be the Hennepin County Social Services Director. Then he went and had the same job in Los Angeles, and now he's with Casey Family. And if you don't know, I think maybe, two of you might know this, but Valerie might not. The two big players in child welfare in terms of policy think tanks are NEE Casey Foundation and Casey Family Programs. And
I did not know that.
Pardon that? Yeah.
I did not know that.
And the Casey family has founded the United Parcel Service, which is now a public company, but I'm sure they have some leftover money. And they are kind of the 600-pound gorillas in the child welfare space, because they're the only people with any flexible money to do training and pilot projects and evaluations for states and counties. So they basically got the alternative response bee in their bonnet about 15 years ago, and they've been driving it hard ever since. They've been paying for these evaluations, which are now coming under fire. They've been paying for training. And their goal, if you go to their website for Casey Family Programs, is to safely reduce the number of children in foster care by 50% by the year 2020. Well, they can measure the reduction in kids in foster care, but they can't measure safety. And so what the pushback is hey, you know, as a result of this kind of voluntary version of child protection you've been pushing, a whole lot of kids all over the country, you know, are in bad situations, and some of them are dead. And so that's the debate that's going on. But Casey, for example, Annie Casey has got a funding proposal to they're trying to get through Congress to totally defund any short-term foster care or long-term foster care, you know, any emergency foster care or long-term foster care. The idea being that foster care is bad, and so we shouldn't be paying for it. So those are the kind of things they do. They come out with these big policy things, and they push it nationally, push it in the states. And there's not really, I don't know if you saw my e-brief 2 weeks ago about accountability, influence without accountability, but that's what I was talking about, is that they, you know, they don't really deal with the consequences of their stuff. So when David Sanders testified in front of our task force, I said to him that, you know, I pointed out that, you know, a lot of these child deaths are, you know, being attributed to the differential response, and was Casey rethinking their position on that? And which was not a Minnesota nice question, but I mean, it had to be said. And he said, well, we don't actually tell states what to do or recommend what they do. We just help them figure out their strategic plan, and we try to support it. Well, you know, there's being disingenuous, and there's being not entirely forthcoming, and then there's just a plain old lie. And that's just a plain old lie, because that's what they've been doing. That has been their sole mission for 15 years. So anyway,
Wow.
that's where we are. Go, Joe.
Rich, this is Jill. I just wanted to ask whether, it's my understanding that for Minnesota, the last time they did a real look at family assessment cases was like 2006 or something.
Yes. It was,
right?
and it was done by, yes, that's right, and it was, they're still saying that shows that the program is effective. Well, there's several things with that. First of all, that study was done by this thing called Institute for Advanced or Applied Research, which is the same organization that's done almost all of the assessments around the country. So whenever a state wants to have it done, it's the same people, and that is the organization that these critics are attacking and saying that it's not real research, that it's, you know, kind of glossing over problems and just trying to sell the program, that's the purpose. And so one example that I actually, you know, you don't have to be totally technical, that I picked up is when they did the assessment in 2006 for Minnesota, they surveyed workers and said, do you think the kids are safer or less safe under family assessment? And it came out that workers felt that they were safer, but the problem was that in Hennepin and Ramsey County, a majority of the workers, like 70%ish, thought that kids were not as safe with family assessment, but those social workers were significantly underrepresented in the sample. Those social workers were about 34% of the workers in the state, and there were only 19% of the sample. So if you had put all, you know, if you'd had a representative number of workers from Hennepin and Ramsey, the result would have been the opposite. So that's the kind of thing that is getting critiqued. And it was done in 2006, it's done 2004 data, yeah?
That there are so many more cases in family assessment than there were in 2005 where that data came from.
Yeah, and I'm just chopping up a little bit. Back then, 40% of cases were being assigned to family assessment. Now it's 75%. And there's been a lot of money cut out of the system. And before that was done, basically family assessment workers in the pilot project got a lot more training, and they got a lot more flexible money to work with. So that's been the critique, is that, well, it's not apples to apples, because if you train the traditional workers in the family assessment and give both some flexible money, then you might get different outcomes from your evaluation. So, but at any rate, there's less money and a whole lot more families being sent to family assessment now. And actually the last 2 years, and so what one of the things the department has pointed to is that fewer families get re-reported in family assessment than in traditional. Well, first of all, you'd expect that because there's supposed to be lower risk. And secondly, re-report means screened-in reports. And as you know, we only screen in about 28% of reports in this state. So all of the times that families might be reported but not screened in doesn't show up in that statistic. And even with all of that in the last 2 years, the number of cases that are coming back from family assessment has now exceeded the traditional program. So those are things that people are looking at. So who we had testified was a dynamite presentation by guardians ad litem, where they had done a survey of 150 guardians ad litem, and they just came in with a whole list of issues, which were the same issues we were hearing in our subgroups. Really well done. Then we had family assessment workers, and this was interesting. We had a panel of 5 family assessment workers. 4 of them were hand-selected by the Department of Human Services, and one of them was recruited by a chair of our committee. And the 4 that were selected by the department were, very pro-family assessment, and they argued passionately for it. And the one that was kind of independent of that whole deal was, saying, it's being used for cases it never should be used for. And that was the next. And then we also had a county prosecutor come in and a deputy sheriff who specialized in sex abuse. They all started repeating that same thing. Many very high-risk cases are being assigned to family assessment. There's no effort to try to do a, to find out what happened. They just sit the family down and talk. There's no fact-finding. So, and then there's Ron Hughes, a critic, and then Victor Veith, who is a Minnesota guy who has an institute at Winona State, who's trained people nationally, both mandated reported and child welfare workers. So these were people that we started to hear from were weighing in on the other side. So it's kind of balanced out. So the task force, the Screening and Transparency Group, that's Chief Justice Blask. She read the legislation, and she says the 2006 legislation that makes family assessment the preferred option has to go, and it is no longer going to be the preferred option. And I think from what Commissioner Justin said the last couple of task force meetings, that's going to happen. So essentially, they're talking about repealing the family assessment legislation. And of course, they're going to repeal this no look-back law, which is saying that you can't take into account prior reports about abuse. One of the issues people have with family assessment is that the philosophy is you don't do what they call fault finding, which is to go in and do an investigation and figure out, if there was a perpetrator and a victim and what happened. So that's been reframed as, well, fault finding is kind of a negative term, but you do have to do fact finding to find out what happened and whether the children are at risk. And so it's likely now to say whether it's that, first of all, that there will be fact finding in every case. And that will include interviewing the children separately from the adults and the adults separately from each other so that you aren't intimidating the children, which is not the practice of family assessment now. And also that right now the determination of whether to assign it to family assessment or traditional is made by the screener. And the recommendation is probably going to be that you don't decide whether to track it to an investigation or family assessment until after there's been a home visit and there's been this fact-finding process. So those are some of the changes that are likely to come out of that group. And then our group, Family Assessment Resources, same thing. We've come to the conclusion that you decide if it's family assessment or traditional after an in-person assessment. There's a strong push to have a multidisciplinary team, which would include the county attorney and probably a law enforcement person, review what the workers come up with. Again, do fact-finding for every assessment. Is there a victim and a perpetrator? The group is finding out if there are any parts of family assessment to be preserved, and that's an active debate. And likely say that if the parents don't cooperate, that the county attorney must be, included in the decision about what to do next. And then there's items with budget implications. You notice that I skipped training and supervision if you look down at the bottom because I don't have much information about them, and I'm not sure they're doing that much. So some things that what we found out is we don't have to come up with, we don't have to identify budget items by the end of December. Preliminary findings are due by the end of December. We don't have to say, here's the 6 items that might cost money. That can be done in the January to March timeframe. But the things that look like they're going to come out is, I'm pushing for, of course, our goal of doing trauma assessments when children enter the system, so you have a baseline and you can see if their trauma is going down, and which is sort of like, are we doing, the system's doing its job, their level of trauma should go down, and we should get that baseline and update it periodically. We're going to hopefully do an analysis of caseloads to see if more staff are needed, and inventory services statewide to see what the gaps in services are. Big item is going to be to strengthen training and to put a quality assurance system in place, and not quality assurance system where you review 20 cases once a year from the state level, but one that is kind of built in so workers do peer reviews and that there's clear criteria for what the protocols are. In other words, a much more robust quality system. Some is support for analyzing the state computer system, SSIS, to see if there's reports that could be eliminated or fields that could be eliminated or screens that could be eliminated, just make it more efficient. And then there's some interest in proposing to do things like laptops in the field so workers can enter the notes once, and they have to re-enter it when they come back. So those are some budget items that are likely to be, or possible to be recommended. And then other developments, as most of you probably know by now, there's Aaron Sullivan Sutton is gone as of this past week. After many years and kind of leading this alternative response. And Jim Koppel is going to be replacing her. And he went from being deputy commissioner, I think, at Minnesota Department of Health to what's a division director level, one level down from where, I guess, assistant commissioner, which is slightly less than a lateral move. But I suspect that they made a special. Probably the governor asked him to do it because he had the credentials for the job. I don't know him very well, but my recollection is he was saying they got out of the child welfare field because it was too hard. And then I said, well, what do you think of our advocacy model? It's not as expensive as the traditional one. He said, well, if you could bring me $1 million a year for 5 years, then I'd consider merging with it, So that's my experience with him. But he does have, he's got support. I got some, feedback from people that I respect who like him, so we'll hope for the best. And then I've been working with an African-American group, so the African-American Working Group on Child Protection, on some proposals. This is just, kind of they're trying to get time to present to the task force, and what they want is to put some money in the budget to really research evidence-based interventions and figure out what's working for community of color or how to adapt them so they will work. They want to propose that there be some navigators, basically a person who would from the community and who would kind of mediate between child protection and the families, but from the point of view of keeping the child safe, not advocating for the families as much as trying to help the parents work with the system. And they want a state ombudsperson for children, not just, someone who's specifically for children's issues. And another development I've noticed is that recently the counties noticed have been talking about the importance of working across sectors and trying to hook up with more preventive type programs like nurse home visiting and early childhood programs. Because if we start screening in 62% of calls instead of the 27 or 28 we do now, and we don't send them all down the family assessment road where most of the cases get closed, we're going to have a big workload bump. And so the interest here is in saying, well, if we don't have as many families who need to be in the system in the first place, then, maybe we can handle that workload. So that's just some related developments to the task force. So for the rest of the task force, I think some of the goals in my work group, at any rate, are, and I think with others as well, I've engaged some stakeholders that haven't been heard from yet. So we haven't heard from youth serving agencies. We haven't heard from foster care and adoption agencies or parents. and we haven't heard from communities of color. So we think there needs to be some way to engage those groups at least, as well as some others. My goal and our goal in Safe Passage is to get as many of the things that we would have been proposing independently in legislation and get them included in task force recommendations where, they'll go through a lot more easily, we hope. And then the big issue that we've been pushing all along is we want an outcomes-oriented system. I'm trying to get them to schedule a presentation by Brian Samuels. I was the executive director of Chapin Hall, which is a big child welfare think tank at the University of Chicago. But before that, he was the commissioner of the Federal Children's Bureau, and he's very big on outcomes, and he's got a really good plan for what to measure and how to train people to do it. And there's 4 or 5 federal pilot projects that are doing just that. So I'm trying to get those two, get buy-in to getting those two to present to the group. And I think we talked about it already, but to build up the program, get support for adequate staffing, support for things that will help retain staff and reduce turnover, like better training and quality assurance, addressing secondary post-traumatic stress disorder, which is what happens to people who are overloaded in child protection, and then the best practices initiatives. Talked a little bit about that already. And then our goals going forward, just to try to build on this momentum, is to really what we'd like to do is to increase our presence so we have at least 1 or 2 volunteers in as many legislative districts as possible. So that means trying to recruit out-state volunteers, maybe board members from greater Minnesota. And I'm working on trying to build up support from the business community. So those are some ways that we hope to build on this whole thing. So that's kind of the overview of where we are at, and we can talk about what questions you have or other things you think we ought to be thinking about.
Well, Rich, this is Joe. I just want to say I'm certainly glad that the years of work with Safe Passages in terms of its evolution and origins and elevation to where it is was in place at the time all this became public and was there to step in and do what you're doing. I think the whole process is going to be better for you being there. I'm sure you would say other people are important too, but I know that your perspective and your background experience and ability to communicate and represent the issues objectively is what's needed. So I'm glad you're there.
Well, thank you. And I think it's not just kind of deflecting I appreciate the comment, but I think our biggest challenge is we got people paid attention to us when this issue started to pop because all of you had been down to the legislature, banging on doors for years. And then the biggest problem is that we don't have enough resources to do things in between legislative sessions, so we just lose a lot of volunteers and have a lot of turnover. And it's sort of a catch-22. If we had more resources, and if we could hire John at full-time to do stuff and maybe another half person, then we would have things to do in between for people that would kind of keep people engaged during the year, but we don't have the resources, so it's kind of, as I said, catch-22. I know we've talked about that many times, but that's my ongoing frustration. I just can't keep up with, activities and stuff to do in between. For example, right now, they have 2 funding proposals, federally, and the one I mentioned to take all federal funding out of emergency foster care and long-term foster care. Well, those 2 as foster care are important for some kids. I mean, what are you going to do if there's no emergency foster care and you can't take kids to St. Joe's? You can take them down to the police station and play cards with them. I mean, what do they think is going to happen? I mean, they're so far removed from being on ground level, and there's no consequences for them making policy mistakes. And then long-term foster care sometimes is the right thing. So we could have a group and we build up to start doing some federal lobbying. I'd love to do that. I don't want cases to get all the way there and we have a fait accompli and funding things all those stuff. So that's just one example. We do a lot more community education. We do a lot more work at the county level. We just don't have the. I will say that, funding-wise, we are building. We went from like $600 a year a couple of years ago to, up around $20,000. But I think if we really wanted to do this, and by the way, about $5,000 has come in for the 501c4, which is the kind of nonprofit that allows you to do lobbying. So we no longer have to worry about getting crosswise with the IRS because we have enough money to pay whatever hours John puts in on lobbying stuff. We can pay out of that pot. But we really, in order to get this sustainable, we would need about $150,000 a year, kind of as for bare bones budget. And that would pay for like a half-time executive director and a full-time volunteer coordinator / admin person, and then enough money to hire a part-time development consultant and part-time lobbyist. And then, it'd be nice to have a full-time director and a second volunteer person. But, we could make this sustainable. So that's basically about a six-fold increase in our current revenues, and that's a lot, but it's not.
What about visiting what the mission of Safe Passages should be in the future, as when this task force group comes to some level of definition and finality on its report, etc. I don't mean that we're going to wait. Well, first of all, I think that process should happen faster than you might think it's going to happen. But what I'm saying is, based on the outcomes of this task force, might not Safe Passages say, we're going to focus on just doing outcomes-based area and focus on that in some dimension, and to use, say, what's probably always going to be a relatively limited resource, unless you can get a direction that you're going to find others, businesses, or others will provide funding for, because they see that focused mission as one that they can buy into.
Well, that's a good thought, because what I'm looking for is something that foundations might be willing to fund, but that we don't have to depend on for, have to have every year indefinitely. And that might be something that we could do, and the same with business. Now, I should tell you what I've been doing with business is trying to get in front of business people, and I finally did get in some time with Pat Fallon, who's the founder of Fallon Worldwide, which is a global advertising agency, really creative. They always get all the big awards. And he's been on the board of Children's Defense Fund nationally for a number of years. And Lynn Casey, who is the CEO of Padilla Spear Beardsley, which is a big public relations firm in town. So I'm trying to, get them. The next step is to try to get them to help me pull some other business people together, et cetera. But it's a long, slow grind. But that would be something, Joe, I think that where you're going is that business people could get behind that. So that would be a strategy where I think people would be willing to fund it and wouldn't just see it as, okay, we're funding some ongoing staff for this thing we don't quite get. But I think the heart of it, if we're going to sustain this effort over the long haul, is we have to have enough, voluntary advocates to keep visiting the legislature, even if things start going in the right direction. We've got to keep that ongoing indefinitely. And that's the secret sauce for, why people are listening to us. So yeah, it's just, and the foundations they just don't want to fund advocacy. So.
The point you made before, I would also say, is that not just identifying outstate volunteers, but identifying people, individuals of color, to be a part of that new volunteer group.
Yes. Got any ideas on that? I mean,
no, but it's
yeah. Mm-hmm.
It has been an issue within the Guardian program a number of years ago, and the Guardian program in Hennepin County is focused on it and is doing a good job trying to address that. But I think the same thing is true of the program overall and for Safe Passages in terms of having legitimacy in that community, broadly labeled.
Right, and I think this thing has really taken off in the last couple months, the African American Working Group.
Mm-hmm.
So we just met last night, and this is a group that's primarily program managers or directors of service agencies that interact on a regular basis with child protection. So they don't have the kind of ideological thing of child protection is always bad and the county is always bad and we don't want to have anything to do with it. They get where the child protection is sometimes needed, and it's a much more balanced and kind of social, social work oriented view. So that's been going well, and so we're making friends there, and I think that'll bloom and blossom into something along those lines. But I don't know, maybe I should talk with the guardians ad litem and ask them how they did it, if they've been successful. And when I think of it, most of our African American volunteers we've had over the years have come through the guardians. So, they're doing something right.
And that's been a focused effort. So, go ahead.
I'm sorry?
I have contacts with some community organizers in communities of color in the Twin Cities. Is that a group I should reach out to and see if any of them are interested in childhood advocacy?
Oh, absolutely. Sure. Yeah.
Okay. I can do that.
If you can get some interest. That reminded me of something else. I don't know. It'll come back to me.
Rich, this is Jill.
Yeah.
There are just two things. The trauma assessment, that's great. Is the task force thinking or hearing anything about trauma-informed child welfare practices? They got the Chadwick program and those few southern counties that they're starting to embark on. A lot of the counties are looking at trying to focus more on being, trauma-informed. Looking at best practice.
Well, yes and no. We had, I don't know if you know who Abby Gewertz is. Abby Gewertz is one of the people at the U who's doing a lot of that training, and she is on our advisory board. What the problem I'm seeing with it is, and I did, in terms of the Chadwick project, which if Joe and Val don't know, is a project in the Rochester area. There's 4 or 5 counties. It's a pilot project to try to train workers and to build systems that are trauma-informed, and the trauma-informed really kind of refers to the ACEs research, the ACEs research being the Adverse Childhood Experiences research, which shows that when children are very young particularly and they're experiencing, they're living in fear or they're being severely neglected, that their brains don't develop normally. And you can't really go back later and fix that because their brains move on to other things, and that part that was supposed to be developing kind of shuts down. So that if you look a number of years later and you do a brain scan, you're going to see those parts of the brain are not lit up like they would be in a normal child. So it just raises the urgency of doing something when children are being abused, and particularly very young, because it's interrupting their normal development. So that's what this trauma-informed care is about. The problem I see with what's going on in Minnesota is just training a whole bunch of people, but there's no connection to implementation. There's not a thing that says, okay, so therefore these are the practices we're going to do, and we're going to make sure that people are actually doing these practices. For example, saying to parents, something's got to change here, because we can't continue to let this happen to this child while they're in this infants or toddlers. That's not translating into practice, is what I'm saying. There are 5 pilot projects like this one in Rochester around the country. So I just took it on myself to interview all of them. I called them on the phone, got some time. And they're all running into the same level of issue, which is they're trying to sell the idea to the rest of their state on a voluntary basis, and it's a slow uptake. So what I would like to do is to say, that's where this issue comes from, is every time a child gets screened in the system, they get a baseline trauma assessment. Because then it becomes a standard practice, and it's not like you go county to county, hat in hand, and say, would you please try it? So, yeah, that's where I'm at on that. And that's why I want to get this guy, Brian Samuels, to talk, because he's all over that. He's really good, and he understands that this needs to be implemented, consistently across the state. I don't know. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, the only other thing I mean, we didn't talk about it, the racial disparity issue. I don't know the disproportionality that we talked about endlessly. Is there anything? I mean, anybody working on that?
Well, yeah, I think one of the, this African American group, what they're saying is that let's do some research to see what's out there to address disparities in a more operational way. You know, what are the best practices? And then the navigator to try to mediate between, and the state ombudsman. Those are all really directed towards racial disparities. And then I was meeting with a couple other members of the task force today. Peggy Flanagan from Children's Defense Fund, who's a Native American, and then Maureen Randall, who's a parent advocate from Prevent Child Abuse in Minnesota. So we're having these conversations about how to weave this into the recommendations. And I think that everybody's concerned about it, but those are the only practical proposals that I'm aware of that are going to get on the table. Makes sense?
Yeah, it does.
I mean, you understand it, but it doesn't make sense, right? No, but I think, so the idea would be on this one here to research to adapt evidence-based interventions to communities of color. So that, what I was saying to these other folks today is we need to expand that from this group that represents basically social service agencies in the north side that are African American and take the concept and expand it to say let's do that across the board for communities of color and make that one of the proposals that we ask for funding for. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah,
Yep,
I do.
I agree.
But, the no-look-back law, which is saying that you can't look at past reports of child abuse and make a current report, that was an attempt to reduce racial disparities, but basically it was an attempt to do that by not looking at certain cases that you should be looking at. So in effect, it meant that some kids have to be more abused and neglected to get in the system if they're black or they're Native American. It's not the place, in my view, to tackle it. The place to tackle it is way upstream, where you start providing more preventive help to families, or you find ways to pick up on issues early enough that some of the kind of services that you can offer will do some good. So that's gone, by the way. The no look back. I mean, do you all know what happened with that deal? I should explain it in case you don't. What
You
happened
mean the
was
way
that
it was?
What's that?
You mean the way the system was or still is, that you couldn't look back and look
Right.
at the previous history in terms of
Yes.
considering the current case before you?
Yes, and so what happened was the history that was the legislative auditor report in 2012 said, this is a problem. You've got to clarify as to whether you can look at past reports or not, because there were different practices around the state. Most counties were looking at past reports. So they clarified the opposite way of what I think the legislative auditor intended, and they put out a bulletin that said you may not consider past reports of abuse when you're looking at the current one. Well, the counties pushed back and said, especially small counties, they said, we can't unknow what we know about a family. I mean, it's not practical. So the state dug in their heels, and this is a typical example of why Aaron Sullivan Sutton got in trouble eventually, because she wouldn't back down. And then they sneaked it into, and I sneaked this, I choose that word carefully, into their technical bill earlier this year as a phrase at the end of a paragraph, end of a sentence on the end of a paragraph in this 30-page technical bill that nobody picked up on. I mean, the attorneys in the legislature who do those bills, nobody understood what they were getting at or what it would mean. And so their legislative sponsors and the people who pushed it through committees like Joe Mullery in early childhood, Tina Liebling in the Health and Human Services in the House, and Jeff Hayden and Kathy Sharon in the Senate Health and Human Services, none of them were given a heads up that, hey, this could be controversial. Here's what we're trying to do here. Here's why. And, of course, it blew up in their face because when the Star Tribune reporter picked up on it, they all looked like idiots. And so that was gone the minute that came into the paper. That's not going to be there anymore. But that's kind of a symbolic thing in the sense that we really need a much better system. Even if you look at all these cases, you have to be able to have some services and have well-trained workers to respond to them. So it's more a symbolic thing at this point. So what do you all think? Is this helpful? Does this, is it too much of a lecture? Is there something you can recommend I be thinking about for January when you have to get down to the legislature again?
No, I think this is really helpful. I'd like to know a little bit about how you feel you're being received on the task force.
Well, personally, I think that I'm only on the task force because they have to put me on the task force. They would just really like it if I wasn't there. However,
Tough cookies.
Pardon me?
Tough cookies.
Yeah, but, you can't be effective if you're in that role permanently. So what I'm really working on is, not getting down completely. Like, for example, the very rude question I asked David Sanders in case he was rethinking his policies or his philosophy. But essentially, I'm really working hard to develop a connection and relationship with Commissioner Jessen and Tony Carter and the county people. And so that, just trying to acknowledge their fears and concerns, acknowledge that they worked really hard on this stuff, that they're on the ground and they see things that are important for everybody else to hear. I'm just trying to build those bridges without losing any ground on the things we really care about. So I'm trying to switch roles. I'm trying to go from being the prophet to being the priest or whatever the term is, without losing the prophet edge.
Okay.
And I think it's working okay. I feel like certainly in terms of Chief Justice Blatt and Dr. Hudson are the two key leaders at this point. I've got good credibility. I'm working with them. They ask my advice. They fold, what I'm saying that gets folded into where their committees are going. So I feel good about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rich.
So,
I appreciate it. This is very helpful.
good. Well,
Rich, it was very worthwhile. I think that you do a good job presenting it and you make it efficient. And in fact, the interactive nature of what we've just done for the past hour is, makes it interesting and helpful for those individuals involved like myself.
well, good. Well, you know what? I hope we can keep this going during the session and keep the energy, because I think it's going to be this could be the session that we've been working towards, most of us, our whole careers, really. I think this is our one big shot, and if we don't get something done this year, we'll probably all be off the planet by the time it comes around again. So we really got to make the opportunities there this year. All right, ladies and gentlemen, if there's anything else, let me know. Otherwise, we'll go off the air.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks, Rich.
All right. Okay. See you guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
All right. Bye.